Worcester is a city in central Massachusetts set on a series of hills overlooking the Blackstone River. It is the state's second largest city and has been an important manufacturing and transportation center. Incorporated as a town in 1722, major industrial development began after the opening of the Blackstone Canal in 1828, linking Worcester with Providence, Rhode Island. Worcester was incorporated as a city in 1848. As Elizabeth Boosahda documents in her book ArabAmerican Faces and Voices, it was this that brought Arab and other immigrants to the city during the period from 1850 to 1915.
America needed workers. So in my book I have a lot of different advertisements that Worcester sent abroad to entice people to come here. And the reason why Worcester was attractive to a lot of the immigrants is because we had the Blackstone Canal, which made Worcester an inland port. It connected us to the Atlantic Ocean. And then shortly after that we had the railroad. So Worcester became a very high, busy industrial center.
The first wave of immigrants were overwhelmingly Christian, and they came for a wide variety of reasons. Few came with a desire to settle, however.
Yes, they were Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. And we definitely had a community of Muslim and Druze, D-R-U-Z-E. And they sold in a different section, the same like the Maronites, but yet there was this intermingling between all of them. My book mentions definitely a lot of them came for adventure and for economic reasons to go back home. None of them came to settle in America. They came to make money, go back home, or just for the adventure of it.
Worcester has changed a great deal since 1915, but Boosahda has documented some of its past grandeur in her book. We went with her to visit the intersection of Norfolk and Wall Streets, the area that once was called Seha, a public square high on the hill above the train station that provided a gathering place for immigrant communities. Further up the hill was the first site of St. George's Church, construction on which was completed in 1892.
This is the hill the immigrants walked up to from the Union Station and from their shopping. This square here is called the Seha, and it's the Arabic word for a large square. And all the neighbors congregated here for all types of festivities, especially at the end of the week. Right here was the triangle building. It was 5 stories high, and the triangle building had the front facing Wall Street and the back facing Norfolk. And here on this side was called the barracks. It was actually a 2-story building. They had a central hallway on both sides of the hallway were the apartments. And on the first floor was the stores. Most of these buildings were commercial residential buildings. The barracks was sort of an affectionate name because the people who came back from World War I said, "Oh, that reminds me of the barracks that we used to be in." And then at the corner there, that's Bloomingdale Court, which is very steep. And the building there the property was first bought by an ArabAmerican, and 2 years later in 1902 he sold it to Mr. Seha, and Mr. Seha had a developer, and that was built into 2.5 stories high. And in the back of that was another Arab bakery, and in front were the 2 stores. Directly across the way was a 5-story building, and it was 8 family apartments, because there was separate apartments on each side. Most of these buildings were called double houses. And the first floor also had the commercial stores.
St. George's eventually moved to the intersection of Wall and Thorn Streets, and the El Morocco restaurant became a new gathering place for Worcester residents.
Yeah, the El Morocco, after World War II, in their three-tenement building, they opened up the El Morocco, which served Arabic food. And there was such an overflow of people, customers, that they dug into the bottom and opened another floor. People who were entertainers, even like Frank Sinatra and the top band leaders who used to play in Boston, actually came all the way to Worcester to come to the El Morocco. And so here in this whole area there were a lot of homes, but they were wooden homes and they've been destroyed. And the El Morocco, the new building, was built way behind there, and that is the original place where the first Orthodox Church was.
A well-documented event in Worcester's recent history was the military funeral of George Beiruti, killed on October 3, 1918 in France, that passed through the square in 1919. He was one of the many Arab Americans who gave their life in service to their country.
And also up this hill in about 1919 was a military funeral. A caisson and horse came up here, and behind the military band there was the Syrian American Drum Corps also playing with them. And the caisson went all the way down to the end of the street to go to George Beiruti's home, the veteran who died in World War I. And then they proceeded to come up to the church. And here in Worcester you'll see a lot of the squares that have veterans' monuments, and they're people of Arabic heritage that made the ultimate sacrifice for their country, including World War I as well as World War II.
The graves of Arab veterans are also scattered throughout the grounds of Hope Cemetery, where Muslims and Christians were buried in close proximity to one another.
This is Hope Cemetery in Worcester, and this is where the Muslim Arabs and the Christian Arabs laid to rest their loved ones. As you can see that the two cemeteries are adjoining, because during this whole period the Muslims and the Christians worked together and did things together, so they came to the cemetery at adjoining parts. This commemorates 1918, the Muslim Brotherhood Association, and farther down below is another monument for the Syrian Brotherhood Orthodox Society with the charter members.
Next to the new site of St. George's Cathedral on Wall Street stood the Friendly House, a community and philanthropic center. Today, St. George's has moved once again. The new cathedral is at 30 Anna Street, and Friendly House is run by the United Way.
I have here a photograph of the second St. George Orthodox Church. And the contrast between what it is today and what it was is that the church was right here. It was set way back, and there were quite a lot of flight of stairs. And then on the opposite, a great huge lawn, just cut grass, open space. And then next to that was the Friendly House, the original Friendly House. And the picture shows the Friendly House being a three-story cottage, and originally it was a convent home. And today, when Friendly House bought the property, everything was demolished, and the Friendly House has this plain, modern type building without much architecture. And what impresses me most is what was compared to what is today. At the Friendly House, when it was opened originally, it was founded by two American-born women that had worked as missionaries in Palestine. And when they came to Worcester, they lived amongst the Arab people because they enjoyed the food. And they opened the Friendly House to have a neighborhood center. And not only did the Arab children come, the French, the Italian, and Lithuanian people. There's no such thing as an Arab neighborhood. As far as Worcester was concerned, it was always a multicultural neighborhood. I grew up on 80 Wall Street, and our house was Lebanese, Syrian. Across the street was the Vito people, they're Italians. And then just the next building down was a Duchamp, a French place, and they had French bread there. And across the way was Arabic bread, and further down the street was Irish. So when I use the word multicultural, it always was multicultural.
Arab American establishments are still numerous on the streets of Worcester, and the community remains vibrant to this day. A vital player in the cultural landscape of the city of Worcester is the Antioch Association. Named for the city that is said to be the birthplace of Christianity, the association brings together the congregations of the Orthodox churches to highlight their cultural heritage and role in the civic life of the city. Activities of the association include lectures, performances, film screenings, and dinners. For Joe Najemy, the president of the Antioch Association and a child of Lebanese immigrants, an understanding of his cultural heritage came late. Even when he went with his father, who obtained work at the American University of Beirut and took his family with them, Najemy, a boy of 10 years old at the time, saw himself as an American in the Middle East and didn't fully recognize his ties to the culture in which he lived.
I guess before I left the United States, I wasn't aware that I was Arab, that I was Lebanese. My parents spoke Arabic, especially when they didn't want us to understand. It was a reverse encouragement. In fact, you learn to turn off the words. And so then, even when I got to Lebanon, as far as the language goes, my father was very sociable, and his Arabic was fine, and he went to visit the relatives, and I went along with him and just sat there and smiled. And just nobody expected me really to learn or something. But being put in an American school in Beirut, this is another thing that I don't want to criticize the American educational system internationally, but it was nice that, not nice, it was typical that there'd be these American schools, they'd be accredited here, they had, I have a prep diploma from the American Community School in Beirut. Everything was very first class, all the teachers and professors and so forth were good. They didn't even offer Arabic as a second language, if I'm not mistaken, during my high school. Now, I studied French, but nowadays they do offer it. But most of the American schools in the Middle East at the time, I don't think they even offered Arabic as a lesson. Okay, so I grew up there knowing now that I'm Lebanese descent, but being more American certainly than Lebanese. My friends were Americans, I went to American schools. So there wasn't this pressure to even learn the language, but I think I did appreciate the culture. The subsequent trip, or leaving the Middle East because of the Six-Day War, otherwise I may have stayed at the American University there, but because of that war, all the Americans were evacuated. I ended up coming back here and going to WPI, which is a school in Worcester, engineering school. Got out and was offered a job representing U.S. publishing firms in the Middle East. When I was born here, my father took a position when I was like 10 years old at the American University in Beirut. So I grew up in Beirut as an American. And I traveled all over the Middle East, both as a kid, but also in business. And I've pretty much been to every Middle Eastern country there is, a number of times on business. And when I returned in 1980, noticing this phenomena that was so inconsistent with what my experience was. In other words, the Middle Eastern people were very hospitable, they were very beautiful, their food was so nice, and everything was so hospitable towards us Americans, and that's how I traveled in the Middle East.
Eventually, Najemy got a job representing an American publishing company in the Middle East, providing him with an opportunity to travel widely. Though Najemy had been a member of the Congregation of Our Lady of Perpetual Help, a Malachite church in Worcester, it was only when he returned to the United States that he began to investigate his church's roots in the Middle East.
Again, I didn't do anything about my interest in my culture or my heritage until we got involved. I came back here and realized what my own church was, which I didn't even understand before, because this is sort of an aside, but we left Worcester when I was 3 to go to Bridgeport, Connecticut, where there was no Malachite church. So we went to a Roman Catholic church. We went to Lebanon, And again, same kind of logic. We were Americans in Beirut, so we should go to the Roman church because that was in English, or at least the priest was in English. So I didn't really understand what a Melkite church was or an Antiochian church was.
It was these realizations that led to the establishment of the association, which quickly became an integral part of civic life in the city.
I guess it all started with the concept that we needed to do something as a community, because what was happening here in the United States, there was a lot of bad publicity about us and our culture and our heritage. So it was the idea that we bring the people, the Lebanese Syrian community of Worcester together to do things in a positive way. What's important about, I think, the Antioch Association, or any kind of association that tries to bring the community together, is that you need such a thing to deal with the secular aspects of our society, like City Hall. And what happened in 1998 was that Worcester was celebrating its 250th or 150th anniversary as a city. And they invited all the ethnic groups to participate. And we weren't asked. According to them, they did ask somebody in our community. It was some priest, they said, who all he wanted to do was sell Bibles. This is what they told me, but I don't know. We still don't know who that is. But finally, when I did call up and say, can we be involved, they said, oh, sure. So that was actually another beginning for us. What happened is we had a whole week at the Italian American Cultural Center of having a display of all of our contributions to Worcester. We had artists show their works. We had different handicrafts. We showed films and so on. So that stayed there a week. And at the end of it, we had a big gala event, too, where we had our three judges that happened to be Lebanese, one from each church. It was, so for all three of the churches, one judge. We fed over 500 people, thanks to the Sahara restaurant that sort of donated everything, but it really worked out well. But that was like our first getting involved with all the ethnic groups as such, and with the city. And that parlayed into this Worcester Multicultural Committee, which you just referred to, which does host a festival each year, of which the Antioch Association has become like the prime mover in that association.
The association also found ways to reconnect Worcester residents of Arab descent to their culture through such means as Arabic classes, in which Najemy himself is a student.
But the lasting result, and we have done many other things, but the lasting result is that we do have an Arabic school going, where we teach kids and adults, and now I'm taking it, even though I lived in the Middle East as long as I did. Unfortunately, I did not learn Arabic, but now I'm learning it, and I'm learning how to read and write it, and we have two teachers here that are offering it as part of the Antioch Association.
The association has not been involved in politics, however, a fact that Najemy, who believes that Arab Americans can provide a much-needed perspective on U.S.-Middle East relations, finds frustrating.
I'm just so frustrated at the situation that we're in. I went to the Middle East as a 10-year-old. I never got treated so well in my life. Everywhere I went, I was like a king. American kids, we were everywhere. We had my girlfriend in high school. Her father worked at the Willis Air Force Base in Libya, an American Air Force Base in Libya. That's where she worked. There were over 30,000 American kids in Iran going to school in Iran. This is in the 70s. I was in the book business there, and we had schools all over the place. We were just everything. I mean, we were really standing very nicely in our relations with the Middle East. To come back here and to see how it's been misrepresented as if somehow they hate us, when in fact they did everything they could to be positive towards us. What we've done, though, on the other hand, is for debate, and I think it's gotten much, much worse now. I mean, it's just outrageous, but that's what I mean. I'd love to get a little more political. The powers that be, though, within the community are, I would say, a little bit afraid to say anything. To deal with the Middle East without talking to the Americans of Arab descent is like is like performing surgery by a basketball player that never had any medical experience. I mean, you can't do it. It's not right. It's a very silly approach to not talk to the Americans of Arab descent or the Arab Americans in this country. immigrants or not. It's really important to understand in order to deal with that.
ران بغنا في شوثه